Something extremely interesting has happened since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it extends far beyond this conflict itself, where a lot of the traditional thinking on geopolitics has been completely flipped on its head. Because a lot of the traditional thinkers on geopolitics were shown to be vastly wrong when it came to their understanding of Russia, and in particular Russia's military power. Obviously, before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia was considered to be one of the strongest militaries in the world. In fact, the second most powerful military in the world, second only to the United States. And that was part of a myth that has carried on since the time of the Soviet Union and the time of the Cold War, where a lot of people built their understandings of geopolitics and the way the world worked as a whole based on their understandings of Russian power. The thought for many years was that Russia could basically take on anybody they wanted to in the world, including even the United States. And this was a myth that even played itself out in American literature. For example, when we look at a lot of the most popular war movies about Russia from this era, and a lot of the most popular video games featuring Russia in this era, it always shows Russia at parity with the United States as a global power. There's movies, for example, like Red Dawn, and there's video games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, and there's also other movies like Top Gun, where the military power isn't explicitly said to be Russia, but everybody pretty much knows that the opponent in those movies is Russia. This idea, though, like I said, has been completely flipped on its head. As Russia has invaded Ukraine, the world has seen that they are only a fraction as powerful as everybody thought them to be. And many years into a war where all of the top experts said that Ukraine would lose within a couple of days to a couple of weeks, Ukraine is still holding strong. And when we objectively look at the facts on the ground, we can actually see that they can continue to hold strong for many additional years, something that I've covered in depth in a lot of my videos. The question that we have, though, is how was so much of the world so wrong for so long? And what else was the world potentially wrong about? And what I want to focus that question on today is to take a lot of these aspects where we overestimated Russia and apply them to China today, to show how far more likely than not, China is only a fraction as powerful as most people think they are. And that's a super important discussion for a lot of reasons. Because in many ways, in the same way that people overestimated the power of the Soviet Union and the power of Russia, a lot of people overestimate the power of China, and that causes them to make a lot of geopolitical decisions that are in China's favor and not in the favor of, for example, their own countries. And if we're actually wrong about that, that has some massive implications. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to be extremely specific, and I'm going to break down the actual reasons that Russia's military failed so badly against Ukraine and vastly underperformed everybody's expectations. And then when we break down those reasons, I'm going to show you how all of those same things apply directly to China. And that's not just speculation. There are many, many strong examples that we can actually cite. And what you'll see throughout this video is the geopolitical version of a phrase that I've loved to use for a long time, which is that the smaller the dog is, the louder it barks. When we look at nations like Russia and China, for example, and I'll also throw in North Korea and other countries like them, even though they're not the subject of this video, we see a culture of large military parades, large peacocking, where in front of the cameras, they do everything they can to show the world that they are extremely powerful, because they want to make a certain perception in people's minds, because oftentimes that perception is just as powerful as the actual power itself. And the perception alone allows them to get the benefits that the power would get them without them actually having to invest in or use the power that they don't really have. And we'll see how a lot of these countries that do all of this showboating, when you look under the surface, there's really nothing there, and there's nothing to be afraid of. We have a lot to cover in this video, so let's dive right in. Now, as we dive in, just a quick note about the sponsor who made today's episode possible, and who has been critical in helping me produce analysis like what you're currently watching. That sponsor is Ground News. I love what Ground News does because in 2025, it's harder than ever to simply understand the facts. Most outlets are more focused on defending a narrative than on exposing people to the truth. Everything has a spin, and usually you're only getting one part of a story. Ground news makes it easy to cut through all of that. For any given topic, they collect all of the articles in one place, allowing you to consume the whole story and not just one person's framing of it. Take this recent story about the United States warning China that it plans to defend its interests in the South China Sea. Ground news shows how headlines from each side approach the topic, sometimes revealing massive differences in framing. And to make it even easier, Ground news has this bias comparison tool that quickly shows where the lines divide. In this case, we find the left-leaning articles framing things around a US-Philippines joint task force, whereas the right-leaning articles frame things more exclusively around the United States sending a tough message to China. Only seeing one side or the other, you might miss key details. There's a lot more to Ground News, which is best seen if you head over to their website and explore it for yourself. Just use the link in the description of this video or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll get a 40% discount off a Vantage plan, which is what I use to get access to all of their features. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when Russia really started underperforming expectations, one of the first things that people began to hone into was how much of this was because of corruption within the Russian military, which everybody kind of knew existed, but it was far more impactful than a lot of people gave it credit for. And this corruption really existed at every level of the Russian military, and it existed largely because of that showboat peacock-type culture that I just alluded to. Within the Russian military, there has always been this type of showboaty culture, even when you go back to the Soviet era. For example, when you look at the Soviet era, a lot of people discussed the fact that when they put on their nuclear parades, they didn't actually have all those nuclear missiles. A lot of the missiles that were in parades were dummies. They were just painted to look like nuclear missiles. And a lot of times, these would actually be taken around the block multiple times to make the parade look longer than it really was, to make Russia's capabilities look exponentially bigger than they really were. And this was understood by a lot of the insiders within the Soviet military who have since come out and given these accounts. Whether or not they're actually true, I guess we can't verify, but given the data we have now, they certainly at least seem to be true. And this type of culture directly contributed to corruption within the Russian military for a lot of reasons. First of all, obviously, there's always an incentive for corruption because if somebody can line their own pockets and get away with it, that's human nature. Even in good countries, people will do that. But especially within a culture where the upper echelons of the military really think of their military not as an actual fighting force, but rather as a deterrence force to scare away larger geopolitical allies, this breeds corruption because people start looking at the most powerful military assets as something that will never actually be used. And so when people think that the military assets will never actually have to be used, they start grifting, thinking that they are not hurting anything at all. Because, for example, if you're in charge of procurement for military equipment and you order a couple of real units, but for the rest of the units, you replace the parts with fake equipment that is far cheaper and you pocket the difference, you think nobody's ever really going to notice because that equipment isn't actually going to be deployed in a real war. No harm, no foul. I get rich and nobody will ever be the wiser. As Russia invaded Ukraine, whether this was the reason or there were other reasons, it became very apparent that this was the attitude that was present at pretty much every level of the Russian military, where there was actually a reputation where people didn't join the Russian military to fight, not to defend their country, but to steal. And so as Russia actually went into Ukraine and tried to invade them, they realized that this problem was far more persistent across their military than they even knew. A lot of Russians were going into combat with fake gear, tires were flattening, which were supposed to be military grade, and the vehicles that were supposed to be running had many critical components stolen or even had the fuel siphoned off. And all of these things, again, it was at every level of the military, contributed to Russia not being able to achieve their blitzkrieg against Ukraine as quickly as they planned. Now, this, of course, had major knock-on effects. Because Russia couldn't accomplish their blitzkrieg, they couldn't push deeper in Ukraine past what are now Ukraine's fortress cities, and they couldn't establish positions deeper in Ukraine either that they could actually hold and defend. That allowed Ukraine to quickly claw back a lot of territory, and the war is now where it is today, with Russia not able to push the front line forward. The question we have to ask now is, if all of this was true of the Russian military, is there reason to believe it's true of the Chinese military as well? And the answer is yes. There's a lot of reasons. There's reasons to know this both explicitly and implicitly. I'll start with the implicit because it's easier to explain. The implicit logic here is quite simple. Even though China has gone to Russia and has publicly said on the world stage that they have a no-limits partnership, around the time that Russia invaded Ukraine, implying that they would support Russia in any way whatsoever, China has not actually supported Russia militarily in a major way. And in particular, they haven't provided Russia with any of the potentially game-changing military systems that would allow Russia to quickly defeat Ukraine and overwhelm them. Obviously, the West hasn't done the same for Ukraine either with some of their most sensitive systems, but they have provided Ukraine with enough military technology to keep them in the fight and to overcome the disadvantages that they had against Russia. China hasn't been willing to do the same for Russia. And a lot of people think that the reason for that is because China doesn't actually have a whole lot of confidence that their equipment will perform well under actual combat scenarios. And as long as nobody has seen China's equipment in real combat, the illusion remains, and people can think of China as extremely powerful, even if they're really not. Whereas if China actually was as powerful as they said they are, they could probably help Russia overcome Ukraine rather easily. Now that's implicit, it can't be proved, but it can be seen as highly likely when you look at how the corruption structure within the Chinese military, from everything that we can tell, is just as bad, if not even worse than it is in Russia. For example, for quite a long time, in several different instances, there have been very public occurrences of corruption within China's most sensitive military units. Their rocket forces, their missile forces, the ones responsible for their actual nuclear missiles. There have been basically corruption scandals that said that these people have intentionally ordered fake parts for China's missile systems. Largely, yes, because they could profit, but also because it was their belief that these missile systems would never actually have to be used. And this has not just been one corruption scandal, it's been several. It is an irresistible urge among the commanders in charge of this. There was an instance back in 2021, and there was also an instance back in 2023. And a lot of the procurement people responsible for China's most sensitive military systems have actually been described by Chinese insiders as operating more like business cartels. Now, this is extremely significant because this corruption is taking place in arguably the most important, most strategic aspects of the Chinese military, hopefully with the most oversight, with the most exposure. If this is happening there, the question you have to ask is, what is preventing this from actually happening in other parts of the Chinese military? And obviously the answer is nothing. If this is happening with China's nukes, it is almost clearly happening in every other part of the Chinese military, even if that public exposure hasn't happened. Because the same incentives that cause people to be corrupt still exist when it comes to every other category of military equipment. There's the profit incentive. There is the internally corrupt structure of a party system. And there is also the incentive of, well, we don't actually think these things are ever going to be used, so we'll never actually be caught. Now, of course, it's always impossible to prove how extensive the corruption is throughout an entire military apparatus. But what's very interesting about China is that historically they have had a lot of different purges and a lot of different big busts where large numbers of military officers are basically busted all at the same time, including in one case, at least one case, basically China's two top generals. And it's not to say that there's never, military graft in Western militaries. It happens everywhere. But what is very uncommon in Western militaries is for it to be so widespread that you actually have to do purges and shakeups from the top down. And the fact that this is happening, the fact that China would target its top generals, typically, when somebody does this, it's to get the people in trouble who are actually doing this, but it's also to instill fear in all the other people who are doing it who maybe you don't have enough evidence about or you haven't actually caught. And when there are purges, it is evidence that the problem is much deeper, much more systemic than the government itself even knows. And so that on its surface is very strong evidence that China's military is almost certainly not what it appears to be on the surface. Can we ever know its actual level of functional power? No, we can't. But critically, neither can the Chinese government. And having seen what just happened with Russia invading Ukraine, where the Russian government itself clearly was not aware of how deep and systemic the corruption in its own military actually was, this is going to give China pause if they ever want to engage in any military action of their own, because they're going to be deeply terrified that what has just happened to Russia will also happen to them. And so likely they're going to continue trying to project strength without actually getting in a situation where they have to prove strength. Now, there are a whole lot of other things to look at, so if you thought that was interesting, just you wait. Another category where we can kind of compare Russia's failures to China and the perception versus the reality is the perception of Russian superweapons as opposed to the reality. So, for example, leading up to their invasion of Ukraine and during their invasion of Ukraine, Russia has made a big deal about a lot of different superweapons, and this is also something that goes back to the Soviet era. Back to the time when Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, even tested the Tsar Bomba, famously the largest nuclear explosion in human history to terrify the entire world, even though in reality the weapon was completely impractical because it was far too heavy to actually be deployed and attack an enemy country. Russia was all about projecting the strength, though, and instilling fear, not actually about having to deliver the capabilities that people were afraid of. And Russia has learned that lesson very well with things like their Poseidon missiles, which can supposedly create tsunamis that, flood the entire U.S. eastern seaboard with an underwater missile that can create a tsunami. And there's other super weapons of the like, but even beyond those that have never been actually proven, because it's kind of impossible to prove the capability, but you sure can scare a lot of people. There are also new classes of, for example, Russian tanks that Russia would often show in military parades. But they were mysteriously missing when Russia actually went into combat in Ukraine. And what it showed was it's quite easy to show a powerful-looking prototype in a parade, and it's quite easy to create propaganda about that prototype. It is another thing entirely to actually have a functional weapons system and a supply line to support it. So, for example, Russia's tanks have barely seen combat in Ukraine. When they have, they've typically been destroyed just as easily as other tanks. And Russia also just doesn't have the supply lines to get them flowing at a sufficient pace to actually make a difference on the battlefield. This lesson is extremely important to apply to China, because China has a different but similar approach to trying to instill fear in the surrounding world. And that is that typically what China will do is they will look for the most powerful weapons of the Western world, and they will copy them. So, for example, China has attempted to copy U.S. stealth bombers. They've attempted to copy U.S. fighters. They've attempted to copy U.S. missiles, etc. Basically, what China does from a military perspective is they don't develop technology on their own. They try to steal intellectual property from Western opponents. This is a very devious strategy because what it does is it makes people in the Western world who know how powerful, for example, their stealth bombers are, be terrified of China if China has the same capability. But notably, China has never demonstrated that they actually have the same capability. They've simply said they do. And China, notably, has never demonstrated that even if they do have the same capability, that they can actually produce these weapons systems at scale. What they are able to do is to release sleek videos, things like that, sleek pictures, images. They're able to parade things, but they're not able to prove that they actually have these weapon systems in sufficient quantities to actually engage in a war against the West. The idea is, if we can make people afraid of these weapons, maybe we'll never have to actually use them. Now, even more than that, when it comes to weapon systems, it's not just about how many you can produce with a certain level of theoretical capabilities in a best-case scenario. It's about how reliable those weapon systems actually are, how well-produced they are, how maintainable they are, the supply chains for repair parts, all of those types of things. And those are the pieces that actually matter if you want to engage in a sustained war with a weapon system beyond, losing your initial couple prototypes or even your initial fleet if China did have a sufficient quantity. And that means that if China were ever to engage in an actual full-scale war with these weapon systems that they've copycatted, it is highly unlikely that they will actually be able to sustain using those systems for a prolonged period of time. And even if they can do it for one or two of those, it's highly unlikely that they can sustain all of them. And as we've seen, for example, in the war in Ukraine, you need to have the ability to sustain all of your weapon systems, because if one category goes down, that leaves gaps that leave you wide open and all the other categories suffer. You need everything at the same time. It is a system of irreducible complexity, and it is highly unlikely that China actually has that. What's really notable is that the United States, for example, has actually used their stealth bombers in combat many times, and they have proven the capabilities. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, everybody knows that the US stealth bombers work. China can't say the same thing because they've never actually used them in a combat scenario. And the same goes for all of their tech. Just as, for Russia, when they went into the war in Ukraine, there were a lot of things that looked scary on paper, but when they actually met the test of combat, they didn't work very well. But there's another way that the Chinese military is not combat ready, and that goes beyond just the equipment, but it actually comes to the structure of the military itself and the way that it conducts its drills. And this is another weakness that it shares with Russia that has caused Russia to perform so terribly. One of the big things about the Russian military that's become a very clear weakness is the Russian military, because it's a dictatorship, again, like China, the structure is very top-down. There are not individual soldiers on the lower rungs like you might have NCOs in European militaries or in the American military that can make independent decisions and react to changing situations on the battlefield. What China does in their military drills is that their drills are extremely scripted, and failure is not tolerated. People are basically expected to follow the plan as it is written. And that is just not a very good idea if you're actually trying to wargame your soldiers for real combat scenarios. The last thing you want to do is follow a script, because real warfare doesn't follow a script. The Chinese military, though, is more concerned with their commanders not looking bad. So commanders, instead of wanting to see how their soldiers perform under stress so they can help improve their soldiers, they want their soldiers to follow a script to the dot, to the T, so things happen exactly as they've planned. There's zero adaptability in the Chinese military, even in their war games, and so you have to wonder, how would the Chinese military react under actual stressors? And this is just another, feather in the cap, kind of proving that the Chinese military's goal isn't actually to prepare for real warfare, it's to project power that they may not actually have. And if their goal is to prepare for real warfare, that's almost even worse, because they're doing a terrible job at it with that kind of approach to war game strategy. So with each of these aspects, you can see how it can help a country parade well, but not necessarily perform well on the battlefield. For a parade, you only need a certain number of prototypes to look really impressive. For a parade, you just need soldiers who know how to drill really well and follow a script to the T, and that can look really impressive. But none of these things prove that that country can actually handle the stressors of modern combat, and that's something that we've seen in the case of Russia, which would likely play out to be true with China as well, because again, the trends run across both of those militaries. With that in mind, let's look at some other aspects beyond just the military to the actual national situation to show why each of these countries is not as strong as most people thought. For example, for Russia, a big problem that they've had is the way that their economy is structured. And let's just talk about this from a geographic standpoint first, and then we'll go into the economics in a second. But from a geographic standpoint, the Russian military has really been hampered because their geography led Russia to specialize, for example, in energy exports, and that caused them to not have reliable supply chains for electronics or really for anything. Russia didn't do a whole lot of manufacturing internally. They didn't have a whole lot of expertise internally. And so they haven't been able to do as well as even Ukraine has when it comes to producing equipment at scale that is of a consistent quality. And that is what has caused Russia to be ground down in a war of attrition. They had things to start with, but they can't replace them as quickly as they lose them, and eventually they get ground down. China has the opposite, but the same problem. China is a very specialized country when it comes to manufacturing. I know there's a lot of people that say things made in China are just crap. That's true of some things that are made in China when they're intentionally made cheap. But beyond a doubt, China does have very specialized high-tech manufacturing capabilities. But what China does not have is what Russia has: reliable access to energy. And this is one of the reasons I personally think that China will not attack Taiwan, at least not anytime soon, unless potentially they secure Russian energy in the Far East. China, because they have such an industrialized society, they are very hungry for energy, but the country is actually very energy poor. They have done some things that make it look like maybe they're preparing for war by stockpiling coal, for example, but even that would not be sufficient for their needs. China, what they really need is more oil and natural gas, but their geography doesn't supply that. And if they were to go to war, for example, with Taiwan, almost certainly the Straits of Malacca would be closed, which is the main route through which oil goes to China, and they would lose most of their supply, and their country would grind to a halt rather quickly. So in this way, we see how, Russia cannot be as powerful as even they could be because of their geography and the realities of what happens when sanctions hit them. The same thing is true for China. In a sustained war, they cannot get enough supplies to sustain as long as their opponents can, and they would eventually be ground down in a war of attrition. In Russia's case, they're being ground down by attrition of military equipment. In China's case, they would quickly be ground down by attrition of energy usage. Now, there's also the economics to consider, which are related to that geography, but a little bit different. And here I'll be brief just because the video is getting long and it's a very in-depth topic. But suffice it to say that neither China nor Russia's economy are what they seem. Russia, for example, has been able to make their economy look strong throughout the war in Ukraine because they saved up a lot of money before the war, and they've been creating a lot of inflation to keep things looking stable. But the fundamental economics are not there. And what they've saved up is quickly running out, and that's quickly beginning to show. And the same thing is largely true of China, where what they show to the outside world when it comes to their economy is not the reality. China, like Russia, is a dictatorship that gives them a lot of control over what economic figures are released to the public and what most people think about them, but those figures almost never match the actual reality of what is going on in that country. China is very weak economically. We've seen this through a lot of large real estate crises that have been very famous. China's national debt is absolutely ballooning, and they are not resilient under economic pressure. They might look good right now because they're not at war, but if they were to stack a war on top of that weak economy, they would almost certainly crumble. And maybe I'll do another full-length video on that topic because, again, it's probably just a little bit too long for this one. But suffice it to say, in a dictatorship, you can make the numbers say whatever you want. That doesn't make your economy as strong as what the numbers say. Just as in the case of a military, you can parade it around. That doesn't mean the military will perform as well in combat as it does in the parade. So in all of these ways, I've demonstrated how China is weaker than most people think, but I want to give you one final reason why I personally don't worry that much about the Chinese military. And that reason is, what is the purpose of the Chinese military? And I would argue that the purpose of the Chinese military is not actually to fight wars abroad, but it is actually to help China exert control internally. Remember, China is a communist country. China is a one-party state. You are not allowed to disagree with the party's official position. And that over the years has caused a lot of problems. People don't always like that. But the reason they're able to do that is because they focus all of their military force internally. China has never demonstrated their military power in a major global scale war. And I think that's partially because China doesn't want to get involved in a major global scale war because they know if they do, the internal pressure will be too much. China has several different regions that they've had to control. They've had the Hong Kong protests. They've had, the quest for Tibetan independence. They've had all the things they've done with the Uyghurs, essentially putting them in concentration camps. And there's so many other things that go on a daily basis where a lot of people in China, the only reason they don't protest is because they don't think they could get away with it. They're afraid the military would crack down on them very quickly. The military control structure also helps China control people's thinking, because the more people you put through a very large military, the more those people are indoctrinated with your country's ideology. And so China has a very large military, not just to scare people outside of their borders, but also because the more people they funnel through the military, the more they can get people 100% in line with the party system thinking. All of that breaks down if the military is forced to face actual international pressures. The military itself, like the Russian military, quickly starts to realize that a lot of what they've been told is propaganda, because the strength they've been told they have doesn't match their actual experience on the battlefield. When the people inside the country see that the military is struggling, or even just that the military is otherwise engaged, even if they don't know they're struggling because of propaganda, that makes internal resentment, internal sentiment stronger for people to actually maybe be willing to stand up and protest things that they've always wanted to protest. So for China, they have far more to lose by getting involved in a major global conflict than they do by staying out of global conflict. Getting involved in a global conflict would ruin the myth of China, both on the global stage, but also internally. It is important for China to project power, to show power through parades, to keep people controlled at home, and also to get what they want abroad without actually having to fight for it. But I don't know that Chinese power would actually pass the stress test of real challenges, real combat. So why don't a lot of people know this? Why don't a lot of people know this about China? Why didn't a lot of people know this about Russia? And a big part of it also has to do with something that both China and Russia do, which to me also reveals their underlying insecurity. One thing that both China and Russia do very well is distribute propaganda and division across Western societies. We see this, for example, in every presidential election in the United States. Both China and Russia actually invest in trolls who spend their time on social media not caring about what side they're arguing for, but literally just doing everything they can to instill division among the United States. So we are so focused internally on fighting each other that we don't intervene against them, and hopefully we don't even think about them. They know that they can never defeat us militarily because of the inherent strengths of our freer societies that lead to inherently stronger technological progress, something that I described in another video. So what they do instead is they focus on something that is not necessarily a weakness of our societies, but something that can be taken advantage of. They take advantage of our free speech to distill crazy ideas that are just crazy enough to actually be believed. They turn our societies against each other, and they are really dastardly and really effective in the way that they do it. That's why it's so important to really think critically about everything you see on the news these days. Because while it sounds crazy, there are literal state actors who are trying to influence what you think so they can do terrible things to their own people and potentially, like Russia, get away with doing terrible things to other countries. So with that in mind, I'm going to close this video by having a quick shout out that is why I do what I do on this channel. I do what I do on this channel to expose people to new ways of thinking with facts that once you hear them, it's pretty obvious they're true and can be easily verified. I try to show all sides of the story and bring things together to a logical conclusion in a way that you often don't hear in mainstream media. And I really enjoy doing that. And if you enjoy me doing that for you on this channel, if you get something of value out of the work that I do on this channel, please do support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It's completely free, but it helps me out a lot. And if you want to support me even more, as always, there are a number of links in the description by which you can do so. Consider becoming a channel member or a patron. And if you enjoyed this topic, I have a couple other really interesting videos on China that I'm sure you're really going to like, including why China is more likely to invade Russia than they are to attack Taiwan. So check that out here. I'll see you on the next one.